See so many keen faces here, both next generation and slightly less than next generation. Really excited to welcome you to this highlight of, I think, not just the PONI calendar, but also the RUSI calendar. But then I would say that, wouldn't I? I'm incredibly biased. I think we have a fantastic program of speakers today. We had a great roster of submissions for our presentations, and it was really hard to select amongst them. So I'm very confident that we have a very, very good program, an entertaining program for you all to engage with. I think it's really important also to remember the sort of the ethos and spirit that binds us and brings us together here. I mean, PONI, since its inception, has done a really good job of bringing together lots of different communities in the nuclear world, both from the technical side, the policy side, people who are ardently pro-deterrence, people who are ardently against it. And PONI has always been able to provide a forum where they can speak and engage and learn from each other in a way that is, I think is almost unique. We have very close relationships also with our partner organizations in other countries. As you know, with CSIS PONI, our US sister program, some of the representatives of whom are here today, and the leader of which will be speaking on our expert panel later as well. But also we have some of our friends from France with us, from a French equivalent, and I hope in the future we'll also be able to, as I indicated in my conference introduction letter, build the similar sort of links with the Nordic countries who are looking to develop a similar next-generation strategic initiative themselves, admittedly without nuclear weapons of their own, but they're affected by them, Russia and so forth. So it's in that spirit of sort of engagement and partnership and a constructive spirit that I welcome you here to the conference today. And I think it's that spirit, in the times of the difficult nuclear times that we have at the moment, I think is particularly relevant, and I hope to encourage. I have some very administrative remarks to make as well. One is that to remind you that all of the presentations will be on the record, they'll be filmed as well, we'll be tweeting, some of it will be live streamed, but the Q&A will all be off the record. And also when you're asking your questions, can I ask you to be respectful of the speakers and sort of respect the fact that they're sort of putting themselves out there. For some cases will be the first time. So please try and keep your questions constructive and allow them to engage with them. The other final announcement that I have to make in that regard is fire. There shouldn't be any, so if there's an alarm, it's probably real, in which case we have fire exits there, and also at the front if you happen to be that way. Follow RUSI staff, and they will take care of you, as they will throughout the day. And if there's anything else that sort of emerges that's problematic or that you need any help with anything, just find someone with a RUSI badge and we will take care of you in that regard. I have a couple of other things to say about how we're trying to stimulate audience engagement throughout the day, which I think is, again, one of the key features that we're trying to bring in. There's two big things. One, we're having a sort of online voting thing this year, which is a really great innovation, which I can claim no credit for, as I can claim almost no credit for any part of the program. That goes to Christina and Jeremy, who've done a lot of work here at the back, so thank you to you. At the end of the 3 plenary panels that we'll be having in this room, a question related to the theme of those panels will be put up on the board and will go live. The chairs of those panels have been asked to sort of remind you that that's happening. We'll ask you to go to a website. The link is sli.do, sli.do. I think that will be up here. And you need to enter hashtag UKPONI2018 to access those questions. We'll ask you to give your responses to those questions in the light of what you've just heard. And then at the end of the day, the expert panel will be given your answers and will reflect on them. They'll tell you if you're right, I suppose, but they'll also give a sense of, try and give their views on the same questions, and hopefully that will be interesting to see how they reflect back. Again, if you get into any difficulty with that, please ask someone from RUSI to help you out. Finally, on Twitter, please join the conversation on that. We're at UKPONI, and the hashtag for the conference is hashtag UKPONI2018. Again, please only tweet in relation to the prepared presentations, not the Q&A. Those remain off record, as does the lunchtime Women of Mass Destruction session and the dinner keynote. With that, all it remains for me to do is to welcome you once more to the 2018 UK PONI Annual Conference, and also to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Julian Kelly. We're very privileged to have Julian with us today. He's very busy, so I'm very appreciative, Julian, to you for coming. He's Director General Nuclear in the Ministry of Defence. He was appointed Director General in May of last year, so he arrived a month before I did here at RUSI. We're just exchanging notes on our relevant experiences in that time. I'll leave you to speculate as to which one was more positive. In his role, he's responsible for overseeing everything pretty much in relation to the deterrent. Prior to that, he was very senior at UK Treasury. So I'm sure he'll have a lot of interesting things to offer to us here today. He'll speak for about 20 minutes, then we'll go to a Q&A before opening up the plenary. So thank you very much, welcome, and welcome, Julian.
Tom, thank you very much for that introduction, and it is a pleasure to be here this morning to speak. If the dinner keynote is off the record, I wish I'd chosen to do that rather than this one. As Tom said, I've been in this job for 12 months. My prior role was for 5 years. I ran the sort of UK government's public spending in the Treasury. I was effectively the sort of UK government's chief financial controller. So it's been quite a shift to come into the Ministry of Defence and do the nuclear enterprise. And PONI bills itself as a cross-generational network which provides the opportunity for those new to the nuclear industry to engage with established experts on contemporary nuclear issues. Well, I feel like I'm one of those who is new to the nuclear enterprise, and probably wishing I was sat in one of those tables rather than up here right now. I'm going to talk about actually just some of the challenges and the ways we in the UK are thinking of addressing the issues around sustaining the nuclear deterrent. But actually, first of all, I thought I would just express my own personal reflections after 12 months in this job as to why we go to all this effort. I mean, why do we have the nuclear deterrent? As Tom was just indicating, some of you in this room, well, there will be a range of views, very possibly in this room, on the utility and morality of nuclear weapons. Some of you may be paid up deterrence hawks. Some of you may be against nuclear weapons on practical or moral grounds. Some of you may well be in the middle, which is somewhere where I probably was when I was first called on Christmas Eve 2016 by the Permanent Secretary at the Ministry of Defence. When I got the phone call which said, "Julian, would you be interested in doing this job?" And in the first 10 seconds of talking to Stephen Lovegrove, there were like 5 or 6 things which just popped into my head, which made me think, wow, that would be an amazing job. And yet, immediately afterwards, in the very next second, you just can't help but confront the question, but is this a job I really want to do? And probably before I came into this role, to some degree, my thought was, I'm sort of glad we've got these things, but have I really thought about them? Look, it is a truism to say that the world is becoming a much more dangerous and complicated place. But I would say that actually I'm really convinced it is, and indeed a lot of the research published by RUSI, I think, demonstrates that it is. And we have lived through a period of 20, 25 years where actually, you know, we're in a world of thinking and probably questioning, do we still really need these weapons? And you even look in the US at the kind of approach of the Obama administration, at least the rhetoric of the Obama administration, and you look at the shift in the more recent nuclear posture review, and that is not just, I think, because there's been a change of president, and you think, wow, actually things have changed, and some of the reasons why we really thought we did during the Cold War, I think, are reasserting themselves now. I mean, we look not just at North Korea trying to develop nuclear capability in spite of the considerable efforts of the international community to prevent it from doing so. And while diplomacy may yet yield results there, history just tells us we need to manage our expectations. You look at the situation in the Middle East and Iran having tried to develop a nuclear capability, and very possibly might try again, depending on how discussions and negotiations go there. Look, these are real threats to international stability and security. And if you look at the start of 2018, who would have thought that we would have seen chemical weapons used on the streets of Britain in what was a highly likely a state-sponsored attack in direct contravention of established international law? But Salisbury is in one sense only just the latest example and symptom in a long list of increasingly assertive and aggressive behaviour from Russia, be that illegally annexing Crimea, conducting grey zone or hybrid warfare in the eastern Ukraine, employing cyber attacks, interfering in democratic processes. The Russian government has demonstrated beyond doubt some malign intent towards the West and our way of life. And we need not look far for evidence that Russia is serious about making its presence felt in the nuclear domain as well. Only 3 days before Salisbury, President Putin was showcasing his latest nuclear capabilities in his State of the Nation speech to the Duma, while the screen behind him showed Russian warheads falling towards Florida. And we shouldn't think this is just rhetoric and saber-rattling. So far from being an anachronistic hangover from the Cold War, in the context of the real threats to our way of life and the modernization and expansion of Russia's nuclear and conventional forces, the UK's nuclear deterrent is as relevant to our society as it has ever been. And we need to remember the deterrent is not just about protecting our own national interests. It is the cornerstone of the UK's support for our NATO allies and of our contribution to the collective security of the West. While many in Western and Southern Europe are potentially more sanguine, perhaps more complacent about the threat to NATO's integrity that Russia represents, Eastern NATO allies are under no illusion about their difficult neighbour. It rarely makes the news in the UK, but the Russian government and its state-sponsored media frequently issue nuclear threats against NATO allies. Those allies would interpret the UK's unilateral disarmament not as something to be celebrated, but potentially as a betrayal. There can be no doubt, if Britain were to give up its nuclear weapons, it would be interpreted as indicative of a lack of NATO resolve. It would strike a hammer blow to the strategic deterrence which has allowed peace to prevail, with some obvious exceptions, since the end of the Second World War. Now, of course, we must keep things in proportion. We're not going to enter into a nuclear arms race with Russia or with any other power. We are clear that we are aiming to maintain in the UK a minimum independent, credible deterrent. We'd only contemplate use of our nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances of self-defense and when faced by the most extreme threats. But we should also be clear-eyed and realistic about the threats we face. Now, some people in the UK say, but the UK doesn't need its own deterrent. We can rely on the nuclear umbrella of our American cousins across the Atlantic. And I have to say, in the 12 months I've done this job, that is probably the question I've pondered in policy terms almost more than any other, as I've tried to get to grips with and tried to make sure the UK government has a plan to sustain its deterrent over the next 50 years. And in the end, the conclusions I come to are, number one, look, are we really comfortable in, outsourcing this capability? At some point, this is the ultimate deterrent. It is the means by which we can ultimately protect our nation and indeed support Europe in protecting itself against the most extreme threats. And whilst I have complete confidence in the US commitment to the kind of collective security, and in all my conversations with US colleagues over the last 12 months, that commitment could not have been more clearly communicated to me. You just have to think, where might we be in 30 years? Where might we be in 40 years? And actually the answer is we cannot entirely predict that. So in the end, I think Europe needs to maintain its deterrent. It's why actually with French colleagues here, it is critical that both the UK and France continue to maintain this capability. Our adversaries also know that if Britain were to give up its nuclear deterrent, it would simplify their decision-making calculus in a time of crisis. Britain and France, with their independent nuclear deterrents, represent separate centres of decision-making within NATO. This significantly complicates any adversary's thinking, thereby raising the threshold for nuclear use. Stepping back would weaken the strength of even our collective deterrent and the security umbrella. And again, in this job, I've had certain people question whether that is really true. But again, I just have to say, when I go to the US, when I talk to our policy colleagues in the National Security Administration, in the Department of Defense, in the US Navy, they all come back to the importance of this point. They also come back to the importance of the point that even with NATO, within NATO, it isn't critical to have more than one voice, which is a strong voice for the nuclear deterrent and its importance in our collective security. And by the way, this has been the consistent view of British governments for decades. And as I've just said, it is the US view, the extraordinary and unparalleled level of technical cooperation between the US and UK on nuclear weapons, underpinned by the Mutual Defence Agreement, where we celebrate the 60 years of that agreement this year, and by the Polaris Sales Agreement, is testament to this. When I first came into this job, again, from outside of the security and defence world, I'd often thought, what is special about this special relationship? You don't have to work in this role long to go, wow, this special relationship is a good deal more special than I had ever really appreciated or understood or imagined. I always have to say, if we were to step back, if we were to rely on the kind of US security umbrella, I also wonder whether it would actually weaken the US's own commitment to that security umbrella. Now, for all the discussion about NATO burden sharing that is going on at the moment as we head towards a NATO summit, I think it's perfectly reasonable for our key and closest ally to say, are you really committed to? Are you in it with us? Are you really willing to put skin in the game? Because if you are, then we'll stand with you. But I have to say, if we step back, you would have to ask yourself, why would the US continue to provide such strong allegiance with us? Or whether at least over time, that could potentially weaken. But the logic of what I've just described would also lead a lot of other countries who don't have nuclear weapons to wonder whether they should need them too. And I have to say, therefore, if you're going to have the nuclear deterrent, you can't view it in isolation. I'm really glad, actually, that I think it's the next session on your agenda is a strong focus on arms control and disarmament issues. Arms control has emerged as a particular international security issue in the past few years, and there's no doubt the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is under increasing pressure, and the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty at risk of failing altogether. But as a responsible nuclear weapon state, the UK is absolutely committed to the long-term goal of a world without nuclear weapons, in line with our commitments under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In my opinion, we probably haven't talked nearly enough about either the work we have done in this area or the importance of this area. We need to consider ourselves a responsible nuclear weapon state for good reason. Our nuclear deterrent is intended to preserve peace. It exists to protect our nation. It exists to deter others from using weapons both against ourselves and other countries. Actually, in the UK, we have reduced our total warhead stockpile by over half since the end of the Cold War, with the only nuclear weapon state to operate only one delivery system, having decommissioned our air capability just before the millennium. And along with the US, Norway, Sweden, we've pioneered efforts to develop innovative new disarmament verification techniques, working multilaterally with both nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. These are just a few examples, and I could go on. We believe these are absolutely essential to the sustained future disarmament envisaged by Article 6 of the NPT. But it's important to remember all of these steps have been underpinned by the success and near universal consensus of the NPT. The NPT has been remarkably successful at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons and laying the groundwork for eventual global disarmament. It's easy to forget this just at the moment, but in the 60s, when the NPT was being developed, the prospect of the widespread proliferation of nuclear weapons technology seemed not just possible, but highly likely, and with all the implications for strategic stability that would entail. Thanks in large part to the NPT, history took a different course. It isn't perfect, but it is the best framework we have for the eventual multilateral nuclear disarmament. But the elephant in the room at the moment is, of course, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, better known as the Ban Treaty. I understand the Ban Treaty has emerged in part due to a widely held perception that the international community is making slow progress on nuclear disarmament. And like most people in this room, I would welcome an improvement in the security environment which would allow more progress to be made. But the Ban Treaty, I think, is not the answer. In fact, my concern is it would only lead to a deterioration in progress on disarmament and perhaps even a reverse of the gains we've already made. By attempting to impose a rival legal framework to the NPT, but with weaker standards of safeguards, no acknowledgement of the technical challenges of disarmament, and less rigorous restrictions on testing than the existing comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty, the Ban Treaty risks undermining the near universal consensus about nuclear disarmament, and it will inevitably lead to a breakdown in the trust established between nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear weapon states. For me, this is perhaps the most important point. If we have not achieved disarmament through the existing framework of the NPT, with which almost everyone agrees, what chance do we have of doing so with a different treaty which does nothing to create the conditions for trust between nations, which is so critical to the success of disarmament? Instead of pursuing alternatives which risk splitting the international community and undermining the progress we've already made, we should be looking to strengthen and sustain the NPT for as long as it is required. And we need to keep working with other countries, be it Russia, be it China, be it the North Koreas and the Irans of this world, to create the conditions where we can take further steps back from the position we find ourselves in today. Now, I would just say one final reflection on this part, which is that, and I've said this to a bunch of US admirals sat in a US submarine at sea as we're about to do a missile test. Despite what I've said, and despite the fact that I do not agree with organizations like CND or the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, I'm actually quite glad they're there. It's really important to have voices that continually remind people doing the job I am doing of just how serious a thing we are dealing with, of what it can do, of why it is so important that we never are in a position where we ever use one of these weapons. And you need strong and dissenting voices constantly challenging us to strive to do better and to remind ourselves of just how seriously we have to take the responsibility that we have of being a nuclear weapon state. Now, a lot of my job is actually about keeping this deterrent going, making sure we still have it here in 50 years. And as you come into this role, the thing you realize is the extraordinary investment that went into creating the deterrent in the 50s and 60s, the actually incredible investment that went into maintaining it, in particular through the 1980s. And here we are, 40 years on. And we've basically spent the Cold War period deferring, often prevaricating, delaying the sorts of decisions that are going to have to be made for us to keep this enterprise going. And that time now means we can no longer defer, we can no longer prevaricate, we have to get on. We are in the UK doing this. The most obvious concrete, and there is a lot of concrete involved, example is actually the new Dreadnought class of submarines, where we're now engaged in the serious process of actually building them if you go to Barrow today. Or indeed, as I said, the extraordinary amount of concrete we have poured into places like the atomic weapons establishment at Aldermaston and Burfield over the last 10 and 15 years, or indeed the most extraordinary endeavour, which is the shared nuclear laboratory that we are building with the French in the middle of France near Dijon. Now we and the US, and to some degree I think the French, all face this same challenge. And as you approach this, the thing you realise is that the challenges we face are, number one, we, the government and the Ministry of Defence, have got to get out of a mindset where we have basically been maintaining something for the last 30 years into a mindset where we are delivering something. And that requires a speed and agility of decision making and a commitment from the whole of government to making this national endeavour work. Now, I would say this government is showing its commitment even by our Prime Minister's announcement 2 and 3 months ago to put another £600 million this year into the programme to build the submarines up at Barrow. The need to really focus our decision-making, speed it up and get into delivery mode is why they've created my role. It's why they've brought all the responsibilities within the kind of head office in the Ministry of Defence for nuclear issues into one organisation which I have the privilege of leading. It's why actually we've separated out the job of kind of project managing, contract managing the kind of new build, the sort of new submarine build out of the kind of generic defence equipment organisation within the Ministry of Defence into its own organisation to give it specific focus and drive. But that is just like step one. Step two within the Ministry of Defence is we have just also got to become a much better customer of our suppliers. We've got to become more professional. We've got to become more expert. And this is all the job we are currently doing. And indeed, we are quite in the process of recruiting. So if there are good people here interested in working in this world, please get in contact. Send me your CV. But the other half of this is we also have got to get an industry which is absolutely focused in the same way. And again, quite frankly, we've been in maintenance mode with industry, and industry has been in maintenance mode. And as we have tried to rebuild a delivery capability, boy, it's like shaking a monster. And just trying to get drive and focus, senior management focus, senior leadership focus, actually starting to apply lessons learned about manufacturing in many other sectors and bringing them into defence and bringing them into the nuclear industry so that we can speed up, so that we can actually deliver this thing more cheaply than we will otherwise deliver it. Because if we don't, then there is a serious risk. You just run out of the resource, run out of the backing to keep this enterprise going. And for me, I have concluded it is absolutely critical that we do keep it going. And then we've got to work on the regulatory side. I'm struck by the lesson of history. When we built Polaris and all of the systems, submarines, missiles, warheads that went with it in the 1960s, we basically went, not quite, from the decision to do it to the decision of having it in the sea and operating in 5 years. Okay, 5 years. For us in the UK, if someone says to me, how long would it take you to build a new warhead? I'm told 27 years. Okay, when did we really start thinking about Dreadnought? 2006, 2005, 2006. When will we get the first submarine at sea and on patrol? The early 2030s. You just stand and ask yourself, wow, with modern techniques, modern manufacturing, technology, we have just multiplied by a factor of 6 or something like that the amount of time it takes us to get from having the idea to delivering it. We have got to change that mindset all round. We have, be it from government, from policy decision making, from the Ministry of Defence into suppliers, working with the regulators, we have got to find a different way of working. Because we can no longer afford to take that long with all of the cost that involves. Now, I actually think there are plenty of green shoots that this is possible. Over the last 2 years, I will credit our suppliers, Rolls-Royce, with having recognised that they had a real problem. And in the nuclear world, having made real steps to drive up their performance and improve it. Actually, I recognise the commitment of the current chief executive at BAE Systems to know that their performance on this area is not good enough, and to begin to take the steps to really turn that round and address it and work with us on it. And I'll recognise the work that we're doing with our colleagues at AWE and their shareholders to begin to turn that round. And I'll recognise the conversations that I begin to have with our regulators who say, look, the way we're approaching this, without changing our standards of safety, but the way we're applying them, we are just tying ourselves up in knots, and we'll work with you on that. But we're at the beginning of a journey. And so the challenge for me is, can I cut in by a third or in half the sort of time it would otherwise take? And that for us is the real challenge in the UK, if we're honestly going to sustain this capability, which I've just said at the start, I see as absolutely critical. I will end there.